Okay, so we're diving into some really cool stuff today, early 20th century psychology.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, you sent over these excerpts from James R. Angell's lecture, The Province of Functional Psychology.
Right.
Which, by the way, he delivered this in 1906.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine that?
Yeah, a pivotal time.
Talk about a time for new ideas.
Oh, yeah.
So what's the mission here with this deep dive?
Well, the mission is to uncover how this school of thought really kind of changed the game for understanding how and also why our minds work the way they do.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, I was struck by how revolutionary this must have seemed back then.
Absolutely.
It was like psychology's rebellious teenager, you know?
Yeah, it really was. To appreciate functionalism, you have to understand what came before it. So in the late 1800s, psychology was all about structuralism, which, was all about breaking down consciousness into these tiny little elements.
Right.
Really meticulous work, really important work. But functionalists felt like it was missing the bigger picture.
It's like taking apart a clock to see how the gears work, but forgetting to even ask what time it is.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And Angell actually makes a similar comparison in his lecture.
Oh, does he?
He says that while structuralists were busy dissecting the house of consciousness to analyze all of its components, functionalists wanted to understand how that house was lived in.
Okay.
What was its purpose? Why was it designed that way?
Interesting. And, one of the things that I thought was interesting, too, is that, he doesn't really try to box it in with a bow on top.
Yeah. Right.
With the definition.
He's not giving us 3 bullet points of what functionalism is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's more about...
He actually calls it a protest movement at one point.
Does he really?
He does, yeah. It's more about asking the right questions than it is about laying down the law about this is what psychology should be.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He says that instead of, just coming up with these names for mental states,
right,
we should be trying to figure out what those states do.
Okay.
What is their purpose? What is the advantage of thinking or feeling a certain way?
And that's what I think is so cool about functionalism is it's really all about the why.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's so much more helpful for us in the real world. If you know why something works the way it does, you're so much better equipped to actually use that knowledge, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can see this, practical approach reflected in how functionalists actually went about studying things, like attention, memory.
Okay.
They weren't just, observing these processes in a vacuum.
Okay.
They really wanted to see how these things played out in the real world.
Yeah.
How did they help us solve problems? How do they help us adapt to our surroundings?
And that's where his example about sensory information made a lot of sense to me.
Right.
When he talks about how our minds have evolved to make these split-second judgments.
Yeah.
About what we're seeing and what we're hearing.
Literally, is that a tiger about to pounce on me? Or is that just the wind in the leaves?
Right.
We need a quick answer.
Yeah, you need a quick answer to that.
You need a quick answer.
Or you're going to be tiger food.
Right. Our ancestors who could tell the difference definitely had a leg up when it came to survival.
Yeah.
And Angell's point is that our minds are still shaped by that today.
Right.
Even if we're not dodging, saber-toothed tigers on our way to work.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Which kind of brings us to another big idea that was brewing at the time.
Yes.
Which was Darwin's theory of evolution.
Right.
Functionalists like Angell, they were totally on board with this idea.
Totally.
That the mind, just like the body, was a product of natural selection.
It's not just some kind of ethereal thing that exists separate from our biology.
Right. It had to work with the body.
It's a product of the same forces that gave us, 5 fingers on each hand.
And I love that because it really does make it feel less mysterious and more like this is a part of us.
It's a part of us.
And, it's funny how this whole evolutionary perspective kind of ties into another big question that Angell was wrestling with,
right?
Which is this whole mind-body problem.
Oh, yeah, the $1 million question, right?
Right.
Haunted philosophers for centuries.
Yeah.
This one of how can something as intangible as the mind, our thoughts and emotions, this feeling of meanness,
right?
How can that be connected to something as physical as the brain?
Right. And what I appreciate about his approach
is
that he doesn't really get...
He's very pragmatic.
Yeah. He doesn't get bogged down in the weeds of it all.
Yeah.
He's just kind of yeah, we know they're connected.
It's connected somehow.
But how does it work?
Yeah, let's figure out what this thing does.
What is it doing? Exactly.
Less interested in dissecting, the stuff of consciousness.
Right.
And more interested in its function, its purpose.
Exactly. And that's kind of where introspection comes in.
Okay.
And I know that gets kind of a bad rap these days
Sure.
for being too subjective.
Right.
But for Angell, and I think for some other functionalists,
Yeah.
it was a valuable tool as long as you used it carefully.
In conjunction with other things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
'Cause like he says, you wouldn't rely solely on someone's description of a cake
Right.
to know whether or not it's good.
To know if you want to eat it. Yeah.
Exactly. Like you want to see it, you want to smell it, you want to taste it.
Exactly. You want the full sensory experience.
You want the full experience.
Yeah.
And he was basically saying that to really understand the why of mental processes,
Yeah.
we need both, right? We need that subjective experience of introspection,
Right.
but we also need those objective measures.
We need to be able to measure things.
Yes.
We need to be able to observe.
Observe it, experiment,
and
and kind of get the full picture inside and out.
Totally.
Right.
And of course, not everybody was on board with all this.
Oh, of course not.
No. I mean,
It wouldn't be science without a little argument, right?
exactly. I mean, there were some pretty heated debates happening in psychology at the time
Okay.
about this.
Yeah.
For example, Edward B. Titchener, who was a huge proponent of structuralism.
Okay.
He thought this whole focus on purpose
Yeah.
was a distraction.
Really?
He was like, psychology should be about analyzing the structure of consciousness.
That's it.
Period. End of story.
Wow.
That's all we should care about.
Interesting.
Yeah. So even within,
Wow.
the world of functionalism, there were these lively debates and disagreements.
Well, that's so interesting. And it just reminds me that, like you said, it's science.
Yeah.
It's not about having all the answers. It's about
It's about the journey.
it's about the journey,
And
asking all the questions,
Asking the questions.
being open to different perspectives.
Yeah, being willing to be wrong.
Exactly.
And to change your mind.
And while functionalism may not be like the dominant force that it once was, it's so clear to see its influence
Yeah.
in so many different areas.
Of mass.
From evolutionary psychology to behaviorism.
Aspects of
Even things like artificial intelligence.
artificial intelligence. That's right.
It's pretty amazing to think about how this protest movement, as Angell called it,
Yeah.
really did end up shaping over a century of psychological thought.
Absolutely.
Makes you wonder what he would think about where we are now
It really does.
and kind of how our understanding of the brain and consciousness has evolved,
It makes you wonder, if our minds are truly as adaptable as functionalism suggests.
Yeah.
Shaped by, centuries of evolution to
Right.
solve problems and navigate, this ever-changing world.
Yeah.
What new challenges await?
Yeah.
What are our minds going to have to adapt to next?
What is the psychology of the future going to look like?
Yeah.
I love that.
That's the question, right?
That is the question.
That's what we all need to be thinking about.
I think that's a good place to leave it today.
I think so, too.
Thank you so much for another fascinating deep dive.
Oh, it's always a pleasure.